vast lecture hall of the Galactic Academy of Advanced Mathematics was a masterpiece of engineering, a place where the greatest minds of the universe had gathered for centuries to push the boundaries of knowledge. The walls pulsed with a soft ambient glow, displaying an ever-shifting array of complex equations, geometric models, and historical records of mathematical discoveries across the galaxy. The ceiling arched high above, made of a transparent material that revealed the endless expanse of space beyond, filled with distant stars and orbiting research stations. Hundreds of students from various alien species sat in perfect rows, their focus locked onto the enormous holographic board at the front of the room. The professor, a towering Zephyrian named Vralkor, stood before them, his three luminous eyes scanning the eager faces of his students. He was an imposing figure, with elongated limbs covered in iridescent scales that shimmered subtly under the artificial lighting. His species had been known for their mathematical prowess for millennia, and he prided himself on upholding that reputation. Vralkor raised one of his four hands and made a subtle gesture. The murmurs of the students instantly ceased. The air was thick with anticipation. Every student in the room knew the significance of this moment. Today, the professor was presenting a challenge, one that had remained unsolved for centuries. "Welcome, students," he announced, his deep voice resonating throughout the hall. "Today you will face a problem that has confounded the greatest scholars of the known universe, a five-dimensional geometry conundrum formulated over 2,000 cycles ago by the esteemed scholar Zemvalith of the Ardent Dominion. Since its inception, no one has successfully derived a complete solution. Many have tried, but all have failed." The students shifted in their seats, exchanging glances filled with excitement and apprehension. Holographic pads flickered to life, and intricate models of multidimensional shapes appeared above the desks. The students, each representing the brightest minds from their respective species, prepared to engage in what would be one of the most difficult intellectual challenges of their academic careers. Seated near the back of the hall, James Carter sipped his coffee and stifled a yawn. He was the only human in the entire room, a fact that made him stand out even more than he already did. His presence here was something of an anomaly. Humans were not widely known for their contributions to theoretical mathematics. The dominant species at the Academy often viewed them as resourceful, yes, but also primitive in comparison to the ancient, hyper-intelligent civilizations that had been unraveling the secrets of the universe long before humanity had even discovered fire. James had stopped trying to change their minds a long time ago. He was here because he enjoyed the challenge, not because he wanted recognition. He had no illusions about how the others saw him. Even now, he could feel the glances directed his way, some curious, some dismissive, and others outright condescending. Vralkor made another gesture, and the problem appeared in the air before them, lines of pure mathematical notation forming an intricate lattice of equations and spatial models. The sheer complexity of it was enough to make most minds reel. Even for the brightest students in the room, it was a daunting sight. "The rules are simple," the professor continued. "You have 6 hours. Work alone or collaborate as you see fit. The first to present a correct and complete solution will receive universal recognition and a place among the great mathematical minds of our time. Begin." A hushed silence followed before the room exploded into activity. Students immediately dived into their work, holographic interfaces filling the air with layers upon layers of calculations. Some manipulated virtual models of the five-dimensional construct, attempting to visualize it in ways their minds could comprehend. Others furiously scribbled on digital tablets, testing various approaches, breaking equations down into their fundamental component. James leaned back in his chair and took another slow sip of his coffee. He let his eyes wander over the problem, taking it in without focusing too hard. The truth was, he had never been good at rigid academic methodology. He wasn't the type to attack a problem with brute force, testing 1,000 different approaches until one of them worked. That was what the others were doing now, and he could already tell where it would lead them. Nowhere. Instead, he pulled out a napkin from his pocket, grabbed a pen, and began to doodle. It wasn't intentional. It never was. He didn't think about the problem directly. Thinking too hard never worked for him. Instead, he let his mind drift, his hand moving absently as he sketched rough shapes on the napkin, letting instinct take over where conscious reasoning failed. Meanwhile, the competition raged on. Some students debated their approaches in hushed tones, exchanging theories and attempting to refine their calculations. Others worked in silence, their focus absolute. Every now and then, someone would pause, shake his head in frustration, and start over. Brockor observed it all with his usual air of detached superiority. He had seen this happen countless times before, students working themselves into exhaustion, making slight progress but never quite reaching the solution. He had no reason to believe today would be any different. His gaze eventually drifted to the back of the room where James sat. The human wasn't even working. He was drawing on a piece of fabric. Brockor exhaled slowly, his irritation barely concealed. It was expected. Humans had a habit of wasting time in ways that defied reason. He had granted James a position in the academy out of curiosity more than anything else. He had heard rumors of humans possessing a strange way of thinking, an unorthodox approach to problems that sometimes led to unexpected breakthroughs. But after months of observation, he had found little to support such claims. James was capable, certainly, but not exceptional. Still, the professor was patient. He allowed students to learn at their own pace. In time, even the human would understand the depths of his own inadequacy. James, of course, remained blissfully unaware of the scrutiny. He continued drawing, lost in his own thoughts. He didn't consciously process the equations hovering in front of the class, but somewhere in the back of his mind, something clicked. His sketches began to take on a peculiar form, shifting from abstract doodles into something more deliberate. He wasn't sure why, but the shapes felt right. As the hours ticked by, frustration spread through the room like an infection. Students who had started with enthusiasm now looked weary, their expressions tight with concentration. The problem was proving to be every bit as impossible as the professor had suggested. James, on the other hand, merely continued drawing. The lines on his napkin intersected and twisted, forming a pattern that resonated with something deep inside him. It reminded him of something familiar, something simple. He frowned, tapping his pen against his chin, and then, suddenly, it hit him. His eyes widened. He grabbed another napkin and quickly began transcribing his thoughts, breaking the problem down into its simplest components. He didn't need complex models or quantum computing. The answer was there, hidden in plain sight, obscured by unnecessary complexity. It was so simple, and so painfully simple, and yet no one else had seen it. The room hummed with a quiet intensity as the competition stretched into its second hour. The students remained locked in deep concentration, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their holographic interfaces. The five-dimensional problem continued to resist every attempt at simplification, forcing even the brightest minds in the academy to double back, question their methods, and start over. The air carried the faint sound of styluses scratching against digital tablets, soft murmurs of whispered calculations, and the occasional exasperated sigh from those who were beginning to realize just how impossible the problem truly was. James sat near the back of the hall, still hunched over his napkin, his pen gliding smoothly across the fabric. He had no need for holographic projections or multi-layered mathematical constructs. His mind worked differently. It always had. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, simplicity where others saw complexity. He wasn't trying to force an answer through brute calculations like the others. He was letting the answer come to him. At the front of the room, Vrotkor observed his students with a critical eye. His three luminous pupils flickered between the various attempts being made, scanning for anything that resembled real progress. He had seen this scenario play out many times before, brilliant students pushing themselves to the brink, convinced they were on the verge of a breakthrough, only to realize hours later that they had circled back to the same dead end. He let out a slow breath, his elongated fingers curling slightly as he analyzed the data before him. So far, there were no promising results. The equations remained unsolved, the geometric models incomplete. The students had begun testing their theories against simulated projections, but each attempt resulted in failure. The room, once filled with eager determination, now carried the unmistakable weight of frustration. Bralcor's gaze drifted toward the back of the hall. His irritation flared for a brief moment as he spotted James, still detached from the frenzy of effort surrounding him. The human was leaning back in his chair, one hand lazily twirling his pen, the other resting on the napkin he had been sketching on for the past hour. He wasn't checking equations, wasn't running projections. He appeared in every possible way to be wasting time. The professor exhaled sharply, his irritation barely concealed. He had been skeptical about admitting James into the academy, and moments like this only reinforced his doubts. Humans were unpredictable, occasionally brilliant, but often erratic, relying on intuition rather than methodical reasoning. It was an approach that had produced some remarkable results in other fields, but in mathematics, intuition was useless here. A problem of this magnitude required logic, discipline, and an advanced understanding of multidimensional theory. James, by all appearances, lacked all three. Yet something about the human's demeanor unsettled Vralcor. He wasn't panicked, he wasn't frustrated. Unlike the others who were growing more agitated by the minute, James seemed completely at ease, as if he already knew something they didn't. The professor narrowed his eyes and turned his attention back to the rest of the class. If James wanted to waste his opportunity, so be it. The real competition was happening elsewhere. At one of the front rows, a blue-skinned Olmari named Kethrin was deep in concentration, his four hands moving with incredible speed as he adjusted a sprawling geometric projection on his display. The Olmari were a species renowned for their mathematical precision, their minds capable of processing vast amounts of data at once. Kethrin had spent the last hour constructing an intricate multi-layered model of the problem, trying to visualize it in a way that made sense in three-dimensional space. It was an approach many had attempted before, but he was confident that he was on the right path. He manipulated the projection, adjusting the variables, recalculating the relationships between each dimensional plane. The model shifted, realigned, and, for a brief moment, he thought he had something. A flicker of understanding, a glimpse of an answer. Then the projection collapsed. A harsh red light flashed across his interface, accompanied by a sharp warning tone indicating an error in the calculations. Kethrin clenched his jaw, frustration boiling inside him. He had been so close. He wasn't the only one struggling. Across the room, another student let out a quiet curse as his calculations fell apart. Others were experiencing similar setbacks, their initial strategies proving ineffective against the sheer complexity of the problem. It was an inevitable part of the process. They all knew that, but knowing didn't make it any less infuriating. James, still relaxed in his seat, glanced up from his napkin just in time to see the first signs of exhaustion setting in. Students were rubbing their temples, shaking their heads, their confidence beginning to crack under the weight of repeated failure. He had seen this happen before. People so convinced that a problem had to be approached in a certain way that they ignored everything else. He smirked slightly and turned back to his napkin. His sketches had evolved from aimless doodles into something more structured. The shapes and patterns he had been drawing weren't just random thoughts anymore. They were forming a pattern. An idea that was starting to take shape in the back of his mind. His fingers tapped against the table as he studied the lines. There was something here, something familiar. It was almost as if the answer had been in front of him the entire time, hidden beneath layers of unnecessary complexity. He reached for his pen again and started refining his drawing. At the front of the hall, Valkyrie continued his assessment, his sharp eyes scanning for anything of value. His species had always prized discipline above all else, And right now, discipline was the only thing keeping most of these students from falling apart completely. Then, something strange happened. A subtle change in the atmosphere. A shift so small that most wouldn't have noticed it. James sat up slightly, his expression no longer amused but focused. He adjusted the napkin, straightening it on the table, and began writing something down with newfound purpose. His movements were precise now, deliberate. He wasn't doodling anymore. The shift did not go unnoticed. Catherine, still frustrated from his failed attempt, glanced in James's direction and frowned. He had barely paid attention to the human before now, but something about the way James was working sent a prickling sensation through his thoughts. James wasn't using projections. He wasn't running calculations. He was just drawing. Catherine's frown deepened. What was he doing? Vrolkor caught the moment as well. His irritation, which had been steadily building for the last 2 hours, was now mixed with something else. Curiosity. James was working. But he wasn't working like the others. The professor narrowed his eyes. He would let it play out. It was only a matter of time before the human realized that intuition would not be enough to solve this problem. He would stumble, just like the others. And yet, as the hours continued to pass, James did not stumble. He simply kept writing. James's pen moved with increasing speed, his fingers barely pausing between strokes. The napkin, once a chaotic mess of random sketches, was now covered in precise, intentional lines. His eyes narrowed as he worked, his mind deep in a place where no distractions could reach him. The background noise of the lecture hall, the murmuring of students, the quiet hum of holographic interfaces, the frustrated sighs of those still struggling, had all faded into nothing. The realization had hit him so suddenly that he hadn't even questioned it. He had simply acted, his instincts guiding him forward faster than his conscious mind could process. The problem wasn't in 5 dimensions. It wasn't even in 4. It was something else entirely. Something the others were missing because they were too caught up in conventional ways of thinking. He glanced up for the first time in what felt like hours. The students around him were still lost in their calculations, drowning in layers of complexity they had imposed upon themselves. Catherine had buried his face in his hands, clearly on the verge of giving up. Others had started over multiple times, their frustration evident in the stiffness of their movements. James exhaled slowly and turned back to his napkin. He wasn't struggling, he wasn't confused, he had the answer. He took another sip of coffee, the lukewarm bitterness barely registering as he adjusted the napkin on the table. His next moves had to be careful. If he presented his work too soon, Vrolkor would dismiss it without a second glance. The professor, for all his intelligence, had already made up his mind about him. Humans were unpredictable anomalies, interesting in certain ways, but ultimately insignificant in fields that demanded structured reasoning. James smirked slightly. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him. He reached for another napkin and began rewriting his solution in a clearer, more structured form. Every equation, every line, every connection had to be laid out perfectly. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was making sure there was no room for doubt. Across the room, Catherine lifted his head, his exhausted eyes scanning the hall before settling on James. Something about the human's posture, the steady confidence in his movements, sent a ripple of unease through him. He had spent hours battling the problem, and yet James looked as though he had been casually sketching notes for a minor assignment. Catherine's gaze dropped to the napkin. He couldn't make out the details from this distance, but he could tell that it wasn't covered in numbers or traditional equations. It looked like a series of connected shapes, almost like an abstract design. His stomach twisted. What was James doing? Vrolkor, still observing the room with a critical eye, had also taken notice. His 3 pupils flickered toward James, lingering for a moment before shifting away. He was still convinced the human was wasting time. James finished transcribing the last part of his solution and leaned back slightly, rolling the pen between his fingers. He had done what he could. Now, he just had to wait for the right moment. The students continued their battle against the problem, their exhaustion creeping into every movement. Some had started whispering to each other, their confidence eroding with each failed attempt. The smartest among them had already realized that they were running out of options. James tapped his fingers against the table, considering his next move. He could wait until someone else made an attempt, let the failure sink in before presenting his work, or he could disrupt the process now and force the professor's attention onto him. He decided on the latter. He stood up. The movement sent a ripple through the room. A few students turned their heads, their gazes flickering with confusion. Catherine stiffened. James walked toward the front of the hall, his steps unhurried but deliberate. He felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, but it didn't bother him. He had been in worse situations before. Valcour, who had been monitoring another student's calculations, slowly turned to face him. James placed the napkin on the professor's desk. "I'm done," he said simply. A murmur spread through the room. Some students exchanged incredulous glances, others scoffed. It was impossible. No one could have solved it this quickly. Valcour stared at James, his expression unreadable. He reached down and picked up the napkin, his long fingers carefully unfolding it. His eyes moved across the handwritten solution, scanning each section with practiced precision. The room fell silent. James remained standing, his posture relaxed. He had no doubts about his answer. Valcour's 3 pupils flickered slightly as he analyzed the work before him. Seconds passed. Then minutes. James waited. Then, for the first time in his long career, Valcour's expression shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but James saw it. It was shock, not confusion, not irritation. Genuine, undeniable shock. James crossed his arms and smirked. "Still think I'm wasting my time?" Valcour held the napkin between his fingers, his 3 luminous eyes scanning each line with a precision honed over centuries of mathematical study. The quiet hum of the lecture hall had faded into complete silence, every student frozen in place as they watched him. No one spoke. No one even dared to shift in their seats. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic tapping of James's fingers against his own arm as he stood in front of the professor's desk, waiting. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. At first, it was just a moment of quiet analysis, the kind that came before a professor dismissed a student's work as incorrect. But as the seconds passed, and Valcour continued to read without interruption, the tension in the room shifted. Students exchanged uneasy glances, some leaning forward slightly as if to hear better, others gripping the edges of their desks in anticipation. James remained motionless. He could see it happening, the exact moment when Valcour realized what he was looking at. His long, clawed fingers tightened ever so slightly on the napkin. His 3 pupils dilated and contracted rapidly, processing the information with an efficiency no ordinary mind could match. James recognized that look. It was the look of someone confronting something they hadn't expected, something that defied everything they thought they understood. A soft murmur broke the silence. It was Catherine, sitting near the front, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. His 4 hands gripped the edge of his desk as he whispered, "Is it right?" Valcour did not acknowledge him. He continued to analyze the solution, his mind running through possible errors, contradictions, any flaw he could find. But none appeared. The problem that had stood unsolved for centuries, one that had reduced the brightest minds in the galaxy to frustration and failure, was laid out before him in the simplest, most elegant form imaginable. And it was correct. His fingers trembled slightly as he lowered the napkin back onto his desk. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to James, his usually impassive expression cracking ever so slightly. For the first time, he was looking at the human not with dismissal, not with skepticism, but with something bordering on reluctant respect. James tilted his head slightly, watching the professor's reaction with quiet amusement. "Told you," he said, his voice light, almost teasing. A wave of disbelief swept through the students. A few of them outright scoffed, convinced there had to be a mistake. Others sat in stunned silence, waiting for Valcour to disprove it. But the professor did not speak immediately. Instead, he placed the napkin carefully onto the surface of his desk and folded his hands in front of him, as if composing himself. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice, though steady, carried an edge of something rare for him: uncertainty. "Explain," he said. James smirked. He had been waiting for this. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the napkin, tapping lightly at one of the geometric patterns he had drawn. "The reason no one has been able to solve this problem for centuries is because you've all been looking at it the wrong way," he began, his voice calm but confident. "You're trying to force it into a five-dimensional framework when, in reality, the answer exists outside of those constraints entirely." Vrokor narrowed his eyes, but he did not interrupt. James continued, tracing the lines on the napkin with his fingertip. "The mistake everyone keeps making is assuming that this problem has to be solved within the conventional mathematical structures that have been developed for higher dimensional spaces. But that's not how it works. This," he gestured to the equations, "isn't just a geometric problem. It's a projection problem. You're trying to map something onto a framework that was never meant to contain it." A few students furrowed their brows, struggling to follow, but Katrin's eyes widened slightly. He was beginning to see it. James tapped the napkin again. "The key is realizing that the answer is not in 5 dimensions. It's in 3. The murmurs in the room grew louder. That was absurd. The problem was designed for 5-dimensional space. Reducing it to 3 was impossible. Wasn't it? James smirked at their reactions. He had expected this. "You're trying to solve a problem in a space that makes it needlessly complicated. But if you strip away the assumptions, if you look at it like a 3-dimensional projection of a higher dimensional shape, everything becomes obvious." Vrokor remained silent, but his fingers twitched slightly against the desk. He was thinking, processing, running through the logic faster than any other being in the room could. James took a step back and folded his arms. "You know I'm right," he said. "You've already checked my work. You wouldn't still be sitting there if there was even a single flaw." The professor's gaze locked onto him, and for the first time since James had entered this academy, there was no condescension in his expression, no dismissal. Only scrutiny. Then, at last, Vrokor spoke. "You arrived at this conclusion on instinct. It was not a question." James shrugged. "Not exactly. It started as instinct, sure. But instinct doesn't get you a solution that holds up under scrutiny. I knew it felt right, but then I proved it." Vrokor studied him for a long moment before finally, slowly, leaning back in his chair, his fingers drummed lightly against the surface of the desk. "A projection problem," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. The students watched, waiting for his final verdict. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Vrokor exhaled and placed his hands flat on the desk. He looked around the room, scanning the faces of his students, before speaking in a voice that carried the weight of finality. "The solution is correct." A stunned silence filled the hall. For a moment no one moved. No one even breathed. Then, as the reality of what had just happened sank in, the room erupted into chaos. Some students were on their feet, demanding to see the napkin, demanding an explanation. Others sat frozen in disbelief. Catherine's hands clenched into fists, his mind struggling to process the implications. James, meanwhile, just grinned. Vrokor raised a hand, and the noise died instantly. He turned his full attention back to James. "You understand what you've done?" he asked. James nodded. "I do." The professor's expression remained unreadable, but there was something new in his gaze, something that had never been there before. "Respect." Vrokor slowly inclined his head. "Then you also understand that from this moment forward, nothing will be the same." James chuckled. It wouldn't be fun otherwise. The murmurs had not entirely died down. Even after Vrokor's formal declaration, after the students had seen the napkin, after the calculations had been checked and rechecked, there was still a sense of disbelief in the air. The weight of the moment hung heavy over the lecture hall, pressing down on every person inside it. James stood at the front, arms crossed, waiting for the next inevitable reaction. The professor, still seated, studied him in a way he never had before. His three eyes flickered, processing more than just numbers now, analyzing the human himself. He had spent years dismissing James, considering him an oddity, an exception at best and a distraction at worst. But now, in front of the entire class, in front of the best mathematical minds in the academy, James had done something no one else had managed in centuries. He had not just solved an impossible problem. He had forced a shift in the way it was even understood. Catherine was still staring at the napkin, his fingers curled around the edges as if trying to absorb the answer directly. His mind ran through every possibility, every alternative approach. It was as if he was trying to find a crack, a mistake, anything that could explain why James had solved it when he had failed. But there was nothing. The answer was there, elegant and undeniable. His own failure felt more suffocating now than it had moments before. The other students were slower to react. Some still refused to believe it, their minds too rigid to accept what had happened, while others, those with the sharpest instincts, understood immediately. James hadn't just answered a question. He had shifted the foundation of an entire field. Valcor tapped his fingers against the desk once before speaking again. "The implications of this solution are not minor," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "If what you have written here is correct, then it does not simply solve an old problem. It forces us to reconsider how we approach higher dimensional mathematics entirely." James gave a slow nod. "That's kind of the point." Valcor inhaled deeply, then stood. His presence alone was enough to quiet the remaining voices in the room. His gaze swept over the class, measuring the weight of the moment before settling back on James. "You will present your findings to the Academy Board." A ripple of shock went through the students. The board. That was not a mere academic panel. It was the ruling body of the institution, composed of the most brilliant minds in the galaxy. Some of them had likely attempted the very problem James had just solved. To be called before them was either the highest honor or an invitation to be torn apart. James took in the murmurs around him, but did not react. He had expected this. Valcor continued, "This solution, if accepted, will be recorded in the Academy archives. It will be analyzed, debated, refined, and you, James Carter, will be credited as the one who solved it." More whispers. A few students exchanged glances, the weight of those words settling in. A human, one of the youngest in the academy, someone who had never been taken seriously, was about to have his name etched into history. James shrugged, though the flicker of something deeper passed through his expression. "Sounds good to me." Catherine finally looked up from the napkin, his jaw tight. "You don't even realize what you've done, do you?" His voice was quiet but laced with something raw. "This isn't just some problem, Carter. People have dedicated their entire lives to solving this, and you sat there doodling and just figured it out." James met his gaze. "I didn't just figure it out. I saw what no one else was willing to see." Catherine's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. Valcor gestured toward the napkin. "I will ensure this is transcribed properly and presented for review, but for now, class is dismissed." No one moved. Even with the words spoken, it was as if the students didn't quite know how to return to normal. James turned on his heel and walked back toward his seat, picking up his half-empty coffee cup. He had no need to linger, no reason to revel in the moment. The reality was simple. He had seen the answer, and he had written it down. That was all that mattered. As he reached for his bag, a shadow fell over him. Valcor stood beside his desk, his tall form imposing as always, but there was something different about him now. A measured pause, a hesitation. "You should prepare yourself," the professor said. James took a sip of coffee and raised an eyebrow. For what? Vralkor studied him for a long moment before answering. For the fight ahead. James considered that, then gave a slow nod. Figured as much. The professor's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he turned and walked away. Catherine was still staring after him, but when James met his eyes again, he looked away. James let out a breath and leaned back in his chair, letting the energy of the room settle around him. He had done it. Now the real challenge would begin, and he was ready.